John McMullen, he has been waxing poetically because he's been writing up a storm over there at 97.3 ESPN.com. First, Leodis McKelvin was here. About an hour and a half later, John, not only was they were interested in him, but about an hour and a half later, they signed him. So let's start there. They got a new corner.
Yeah, and they acted pretty quickly, obviously. After one day, after agreeing to trade Byron Maxwell, they bring in a guy that Jim Schwartz is very familiar with. And I think once they got him in the building, they understood that the Dallas Cowboys were also interested. So the mentality was not to let him leave. And because he was released last Friday, he didn't have to wait till the start of a new league year like free agents that have expired contracts, so the Eagles could act, and they acted quickly. And this is a guy with a pretty good pedigree. He's a former first-round pick, didn't play all that well last season, but he had his best year under Jim Schwartz, career-high 4 interceptions. So I think that's the mentality, that you could reunite him with the Eagles' new defensive coordinator, and hopefully he'll turn back into the player he was in Buffalo.
Yeah, John, and, an interesting thing I'll ask you is, do you look at McKelvin as a number one corner? I mean, is he a top starting level corner? Look, I'll take the price tag on him, but are they going to have to get a better player than McKelvin to play opposite him?
Yeah, I don't think he's a number one corner at this stage. You have to realize this is a guy who's 30 years old. He only played 9 games last season because of an ankle injury. And really, injuries have hampered him throughout his career. He's only finished 3 full seasons. So he's only played 16 games 3 times. This is not a number one corner by any stretch of the imagination. But we talked about it. This team needed depth. You say what you want about Byron Maxwell. He's out there. I think he played 14 of the 16 games last season. He's somebody you can count on, and you need bodies at that particular position. This is not the end of it. I was already told they still want Nolan Carroll back. So there's going to be more bodies added at the cornerback position.
And we're also, by the way, real fast, going down that Buffalo pipeline, Nigel Bradham, another linebacker from the Jim Schwartz. He had a great year for Schwartz in 14, did not have a good year last year with Rex Ryan. So it sounds like Buffalo was becoming the Oregon Ducks of this new regime.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I like that, to be honest. I criticize Chip Kelly for that. I'm not going to differentiate just because it's somebody else. I think you have to have an open mind. It's not to say we all understand coaches get comfortable with certain players, but you can't be myopic about it. And you have to be able to look at personnel around the league and see if there are better fits. Not that I'm criticizing this signing, because I think it is what it is. And McKelvin's a guy who is a versatile player. He can play outside. He can play in the slot. He's been a great kick returner, so that adds another thing. If you want to give Darren Sproles a break here and again, if you want to go in a different direction, he's been tremendous at that through his NFL career. So I have no issue with it, but if this becomes a pattern similar to what it was under Chip Kelly, I think you start to get a little bit concerned.
John, when you talk secondary, Mike and I were talking in the last hour about Eric Rowe and how do the Eagles view him, and I thought Mike had a fair question of, do they look at him as a corner? Do they look at him as a safety? How do you view Eric Rowe?
I think it's going to be a corner. And we're not going to know that 100% until we get to OTAs and see what Jim Schwartz thinks of him. But so far he said corner, and he has. It's good to have versatile players. We just talked about it with McKelvin. You can talk about it with Rowe if it doesn't work out. He's got a lot more experience at the college level at safety. He's certainly got the frame to hold up at safety. But this is a team that needs cornerbacks, and this is a rookie player last year who at least late in the season showed some significant promise, and I don't think that's one thing they want to give up on from the from the Chip Kelly regime. He was one guy I think they looked at and said, hey, if everything works out well, this is a guy with the skill set who could be that number one corner that they don't have right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. We were talking about that before you came on, John, is how is this new regime going to view Eric Rowe? Are they going to view him as a corner? Are they going to view him as a safety? And that might give us a better indication of what they need to do in free agency or the draft in terms of they need to find another safety, and they're going to have to find another corner. If they view Rowe as a safety, maybe they need to find two corners. If they view Rowe as a corner, then they need to find a safety and a corner.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it's going to be a safety in a corner. I think, as I said, I think they want to bring Nolan Carroll back, but I don't think Walter Thurman's going to be back. So obviously that opens up a hole at that particular position. And, you know, anytime it's easy to get rid of players, as we talked about when Chip Kelly got rid of Deshaun Jackson, LaShawn McCoy, Jeremy Maclin, letting them go unsigned. It's more difficult to replace them. And even though Byron Maxwell didn't produce and DeMarco Murray didn't produce and Kiko Alonso didn't produce, you have to replace them. And somebody has to play there. The first domino fell today with McKelvin, but obviously this is a team that needs to bolster up on defense, and that starts tomorrow with free agency and then continues on with the draft.
All right, John. Yesterday, you know, we were asking you, look, if he could get rid of Maxwell and he can get rid of Alonso, would we anticipate that there's a way he could get rid of Murray? About 3 hours later, he did. So what say you about the job Roseman did yesterday, first on the earlier trade and then being able to get rid of DeMarco Murray?
Well, I think you got to give him a ton of credit for getting rid of those contracts. We all thought it wasn't possible. It wasn't plausible, and he did it. So for whatever you want to say about Howie, and I've been saying it since day one, since he took back control of this team, he is tremendous when it comes to contracts and working the salary cap. He's one of the best in the business. The questions become, can he replace these guys with talent that produces more than they were able to? And that remains to be seen, and that's the concern you have because he doesn't necessarily have the traditional football background, and it's not unfair to point that out. But from a salary cap perspective and from a contract perspective, he is digging out of the holes, some of the holes Chip Kelly put them in, that nobody in this league thought he could get out of this quickly.
John, all right, the Murray thing, does it matter what the compensation is for Murray?
Not for me. I mean, as long as you're out of that contract, and we presume it's going to be a late round, maybe a conditional pick, depending on how much he's able to produce in Tennessee. That was a bad contract. We've been talking about it basically since it was signed. It didn't make a lot of sense at the time, and that's when it looked far better, and we thought we were going to get more out of DeMarco Murray. Then it turns into a basically 700-yard rushing season where he averages 3.6 yards per carry, doesn't have any explosion, looks like physically he's done, and the contract looks even worse than it looked originally. So I think the big upside of that particular deal is just getting rid of that contract and moving on from that perspective. You thought you would have to suffer through another year of DeMarco Murray and then move on, and he got a 365-day head start, basically.
So what's the running back situation? Do they keep Matthews now? Do they still try to move Matthews? I mean, do they draft a running back? Are they okay with – I can't imagine Sproles and Barner is what you want to go into the season with.
No, they're not going to go into the season with Darren Sproles and Kenyon Barner as the two lead backs on this team. But from all indications I get, Ryan Matthews is still on the trading block. Howie's not a particular fan of his either. So it wouldn't surprise me if at some point they move on and they're going to have to address the running back position, whether it's in the draft or free agency. It's a lot of big names backs out there in free agency, but the Eagles are not going to be involved with them. They've learned their lesson from the Demarco Murray issue. So when you look at guys like Doug Martin or Matt Forte or Lamar Miller, the position has been so devalued. I think the mentality is, hey, we can get somebody in the third, fourth round of the draft and make do, or we can get a second-level free agent and make do. And I think if you look around the league, that's been proven time and time again, whether it's in Seattle and Thomas Rawls replacing Marshawn Lynch, or you saw how Kansas City and Doug Peterson was so successful when Jamal Charles went down.
What about Fletcher Cox, John, for all the moves that have been announced, or all the deals and wheeling and dealing that seems to be taking place? We still haven't heard about a contract extension for him. What do you think the delay is there?
Well, and also to add to that, what about what it means for him after that deal for Malik Jackson today?
Yeah, well, that's a bigger deal for the Eagles than him. He understands he can get that kind of money, and that's why it's been so difficult. Howie Roseman makes every indication to point to Fletcher every time he signs somebody. And when they announced the Sam Bradford signing, Howie actually said everything we do as far as the salary cap, we do in the back of our mind, we have to get Fletcher Cox done. So no matter who he signs, there's going to be space for Fletcher Cox, and they want to get it done as quickly as possible. The problem is, as Mike pointed out, if you look at the contracts and you look at the money, Fletcher Cox and his representatives aren't dumb. They know he's going to cash in, and he's still making pretty significant money on the final year of his rookie deal. So if he wants to sort of bet on himself and get to free agency, I don't believe that would ever happen. The Eagles would franchise him. But the worst-case scenario for him is he'd be playing under the franchise tag, or the team would be forced to get one of these massive deals, whether it's Malik Walker. It's going to be more than that. And you hate to say it from the Eagles standpoint, but I'm sure his agents are talking about Ndamukong Suh type money.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. All right, there's a lot of moves. Let's get to some of them, John. The Vikings cut Mike Wallace. Going to save him money. Does he got anything left in the tank?
I think he does. Remember, this is a speed guy. It's another example of the Dolphins making bad decisions. They backed up the Brinks truck a couple years ago to sign him to an outrageous contract. Didn't work out there. Vikings traded for him. They got to walk away from $11.5 million. No salary cap hit whatsoever. So you knew he was going to hit the open market, and because there are no good wide receivers really in free agency, the best one is Marvin Jones. All of a sudden, Mike Wallace doesn't look too bad. So I think he's going to get more interest than people think, simply because there's not a lot of other options.
All right, so Wallace is interesting, because he's a guy who's kind of bounced around since successful time in Pittsburgh. Let me get your thoughts on the Osweiler situation and where you think is going to happen with him, because I think that one's getting pretty interesting now all of a sudden.
Yeah, it is. I mean, he's going to, if he wants to get to free agency, he's going to be able to make anywhere from $16 to $18 million. I think the Texans will go all out and possibly offer him, certainly going to offer more than Denver can afford. Denver cut 3 players today to try to get more salary cap space just to sign Brock Osweiler. And we're talking about a guy who started 7 games, and if you can get 14 or 15 million from the Denver Broncos, who are obviously the Super Bowl champions, and you can play in that system, and you can play with the Von Millers of the world, I don't see why you would want to leave that for a couple extra million. But it's also difficult to tell a player to take less. And if he gets to the free agent market and the money is there in Houston, and that's also projected to be a pretty good team if they can get competent quarterback play, anything can happen. So those two teams are going to be battling each other, and it's going to be up to Brock Osweiler. If he wants to stay with the Super Bowl champions, and take a few million less, or if he wants to break the bank.
Yeah, and you mentioned, we talked about Malik Jackson. He got a 6-year, $90 million deal. Speaking of the Super Bowl champions, there's a first piece of that moving. He had a big 2015, but he's going to be going from the 3-4 to a 4-3 for Malik Jackson. 6-year, $90 million. Does that deal say that Jacksonville means business now, or is that going to be one of these deals where you're looking at a guy who basically goes from star to whatever happened to him?
Yeah, I mean, it shows Jacksonville means business, but it's a bad contract. It's a good player getting great player money. You have to realize Malik Jackson was playing next to Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, Derek Wolfe. These are all impact players. He's not going to be playing next to them in Jacksonville. So it's going to be a similar situation to what happened here in Philadelphia with Byron Maxwell, who in Seattle was playing with Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. It's a little bit different when you're getting double-teamed as opposed to who's going to double-team Malik Jackson when you got to worry about blocking Von Miller and Wolf and DeMarcus Ware? Nobody. He never saw a double-team in his life. And all of a sudden he's making $15 million a year for Jacksonville, and it's a perfect example of somebody getting their paycheck, guys, on Friday and going to the grocery store hungry. Jacksonville had $83 million to play with under the cap, and they have too much money for their own good, and they gave a good player, great player money.
On Fox Sports, Mike Garofalo reporting that Chase Daniel remaining a possibility in Philadelphia. Your thoughts on Chase Daniel still perhaps becoming an Eagle?
Yeah, I think it's real. I've always said that you could kind of tell he won't come out and say it, but I don't think Doug Peterson is a big fan of Mark Sanchez as a backup quarterback. And
well, he was endorsed by Chip Kelly. Of course he's not.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not that obviously they could have cut him outright. So it's not that they've made up their mind and they're certainly going to move forward. But if there's a way he can get Chase Daniel, who's very, very comfortable with, obviously, to be a backup quarterback here, I don't think there's any doubt that the Eagles would rather go with that plan than going with Sanchez as a backup.
All right, John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. We're looking at some of the NFL news and notes. Matt Forte, interested. I think 31, he's a tough spot for running back. Packers expressing interest in him. What's your story with Forte here? Do you think he ends up getting a big deal?
Well, that would be a perfect deal for Green Bay. Obviously, Eddie Lacy is in their doghouse. He played about 35 pounds overweight last year. And Matt Forte is just a professional. But the thing about Green Bay is they rarely go into free agency. Almost their entire roster is homegrown, and that's their belief. And they don't like free agency, but they do it occasionally. They did it a few years ago with Julius Peppers. That worked out well for them. To me, this would be a home run signing for a team that's on the cusp of being a contender, and all of a sudden you get a great three-down back who can run the football, catch it out of the backfield, great pass protector. It makes a ton of sense, but you have to be concerned. Anytime a running back reaches the age of 30, we've seen the history, and Forte's got a lot of touches. So it would be rolling the dice, and that's typically something that Ted Thompson and Green Bay doesn't like to do.
All right, last couple of things here for you, John. JPP gets a 1-year deal, so I guess it's another year for the Giants to figure out what they think of their former elite pass rusher.
Yeah, and I think it's more from his perspective, really, because he thinks he can figure it out and play with the hand and become a dominant player again. We'll see. If he can, obviously, he's in line to make much more than he got. And there was some interest. Arizona was coming hard. They need a pass rusher badly, and they were coming after him. Obviously, he feels more comfortable with the Giants. I think he really garnered more respect for the organization when they did bring him back after the accident. And they did pay him significant money last year, despite the fact that he hid the medical records and waited so long to explain what was going on. So I think he showed some loyalty to that organization, and he should have. Whether he ever becomes the player he once was, I don't see how that's possible from watching him play. He got in the position to make plays time and time again because of his superior athleticism, but he couldn't wrap up playing with that big club on his hand. I don't know how that changes moving forward.
John, Calvin Johnson announces his retirement from the NFL after 9 seasons today. Do you think that that's legit, or is that just, my body's hurting, I'm going to walk away, and then maybe I'll pull a Michael Jordan and come back?
Well, I think it's legit for now. He might pull that next season after sitting out a season. The thing is, it had more to do than just health. There's no question he's been banged up in recent seasons, but he had a $24 million cap number if he was going to move forward with the Lions, and there's no way that was tenable. So Detroit was going to ask him to restructure his deal, or they were going to have to cut him. And when you're a player at the stature of Calvin Johnson, it's pretty difficult to continue to say he's already banked over $100 million, and to come back and play for much less money. I think that's the bigger issue with him. He just doesn't feel that it's worth it. And maybe that changes next season, and he rethinks it. But I think it had more to do with his contract situation than his health.
All right, John's got plenty more at 973ESPN.com, at JF McMullen on Twitter as well. And, of course, every day here on the Sports Bash with all the NFL news, notes, draft stuff coming up. We can't even get into the draft. They keep doing so much here.
I know. Every day. This team is killing me, guys.
And you love it.
I said, John just put a piece up at 2:50 on McKelvin. And about an hour later, I went to the post section. I said, and he's got another one working on right now that McKelvin just signed. So we know John's getting a lot of work done. And don't forget his national work at todayspigskin.com. All right, John. Appreciate it, pal.
All right. Thanks, guys.